Hello, everybody. Welcome to the September 19th instance of the Gateway API Gamma meeting. As a reminder, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so please be respectful to everybody. We have an open agenda. We've got a couple of topics today, but if you have anything you'd like to talk about, please feel free to add that to the agenda. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can all be watching the agenda. The share screen button moved a little bit on me. All right, found it. All right, can y'all see my screen?
This is why Zoom prevents us
Yes.
from having nice things.
Oh, yes, and please make sure to add your name in the attendees list so we can keep track of who's attending. I'll just go ahead and add myself there, over here, and spell my employer's name correctly while I'm at it. But the first item on our agenda is from Nick. I don't think he's here for time zone reasons, but does anybody want to discuss adding mesh resource?
Yeah, I can try and represent his, I think we both have similar thoughts here. In Gateway class, we've been trying to do two things. We've been trying to add a list of supported features and also a way to warn if and when the implementation detects that the version of CRDs is not something they recognize. So there may be features that are configured that they don't understand, basically. It'd be really nice to have a place to put that kind of stuff for mesh implementations somewhere. Because I expect there'll become a day where some mesh implementations don't support some things in Gateway API, Gamma, whatever, and it would be nice to be able to communicate that. I think a mesh resource may also have other value, such as, Keith, you had the thing about policy. Yeah, maybe that's a thing. I think there's other potential pieces of value here. I do recognize that adding a cluster scope resource is not going to be popular for a variety of reasons. So maybe it doesn't need to be cluster scoped. I haven't thought about that as much, but I do think we need some way, or we would benefit from having some way to represent these concepts. I know we intentionally avoided this early days. Does anyone feel strongly about this at this point?
I still feel like this is what we should be doing. We should have this resource. What we're seeing with Gateway class and stuff like that, and all these other things where we want statuses on them, is helping to reinforce that. But I definitely, from a user perspective, can definitely see reasons why you'd want to be able to kind of see that there is a mesh by checking for meshes as a resource. Like, that makes perfect sense to me.
The thing that I find really interesting about that is that your last point, Shane, would actually imply that it should be a cluster scoped resource. But
yeah, I mean, I don't know if I feel how I feel about that, because the problem is we have these people who will not touch them. We have customers at Kong that are mad about Gateway class because they're like, nope, we will never do that. We will not use cluster scope resources. Please F off. Like,
why are they? All right, I'll play the hopelessly naive person for a moment. Why are they so mad about cluster scope resources? I can imagine several different reasons. I'm curious if they've vocalized anything more than a religious objection here.
I think it's mostly a religious objection, and it stems from like this: we don't want to give RBAC permissions to cluster scope resources to anyone if we don't absolutely need to. And yeah, I don't think it's every conversation I've actually had with customers about this, it's more of like no, we're just not going to start including cluster scope resources for an ingress controller. we argue with them about it. We're like, and I
Yeah.
think actually, at least in one case, we had somebody who kind of came and saw like, all right, we'll see if we can get with the program, and started
mean-
trying our gateway implementation and has stopped complaining. But it is not just, I wouldn't even be talking about this if it wasn't for the fact that I've heard this from other implementations. I've heard
Yeah.
like, if it was just Kong, I'd be like, well, our customers are, have a different use case or something. We have some more traditional like infrastructures type work use cases and stuff. Maybe it's just stems from that. But I've heard it from, Nick. Nick has been saying that that's been a thing that's going on, at least with Contour, if not also with ISA Valent.
I have no direct experience with that because, my time with Emissary, we didn't have any cluster scope resources. So Keith has been patiently waiting. So Keith, why don't you interrupt?
Yeah, this is interesting to me. On the initial use case, I'm a big +1. I don't see any big reasons to not do this. I think it's useful. I do think that I've been looking into policy attachment on the SEO side, doing some work there recently. So this obviously sets my mind in a couple of different directions. Because at the moment right now, when you look at Gateway API's mesh supports and inherited policy, there's not really, you can go like service to route, or
Sorry,
the
say
way
that
around
again?
technically. So like when you look at Gateway API's mesh support and inherited policy attachment, like on the ingress side, you can do like gateway class to gateway to route, even to backend. With mesh, it's a little less clear. You can go from that route and service. But if you want to, for example, set a default policy across your entire mesh, there's no way to do that. I think we floated this idea in the past, and we said we'll defer that until we have kind of a more compelling need or customer ask. This feels like it might be, as far as the conformance stuff, feels like it's a better, a more compelling use case. And if that use case is more compelling, I'm interested in exploring what that looks like, because in Istio we kind of have this whole namespace. Like if you install a resource in the root namespace, the system namespace for the Istio installation, then that's your mesh default. Like we have another way of doing this pattern. But I think the idea of having two meshes installed is compelling. It does get weird with versioning. I think that, before we go too far in the direction, I think versioning is something you have to figure out. Do two versions of the same mesh share the same cluster scoped mesh resource? Out of defaults propagate back and forth. I think that's an open question. But I don't know that we have to answer that now. I think that this is just for the point being brought up, for conformance status features and version compatibility. I think that a mesh resource makes sense.
I was thinking of sorry, I was thinking about that question of cluster scope versus not, and it remains increasingly difficult for me to come up with a real world use case to have two meshes installed at the same time. But it's also pretty difficult for me to think that it's really that much harder to just go and say, give me all the mesh resources in the cluster, as opposed to give me a single cluster scoped mesh resource. So, for Linkerd, the idea that you would toss a mesh resource in the Linkerd namespace and have it be namespace scoped. Sure, fine. That seems like a reasonable way to do that.
Is having two meshes of the same type less contrived in your experience?
I think it's
Isolated
important.
networks?
I think it's important to lay my biases on the table here. Linkerd is typically simple enough to upgrade and downgrade that people, rather than trying to run two versions in the same cluster, they would tend to just try the new version on staging or try it on a developer cluster and then go ahead and upgrade production.
I get that. I was thinking more from a tenancy perspective with Linkerd.
From a tenancy
Do they ever want two
perspective,
separate isolated mesh networks on the same cluster?
From a tenancy perspective, the simple way to do that with Linkerd is two separate clusters that can talk to each other.
Okay, dope.
I mean, it's
Yeah, two
clusters
separate.
clusters are, you know, clusters are cheap, right? And Linkerd as of 2.14 can do flat network multi-cluster rather simply. So yeah,
Just checking.
It's a little weird to me to think of I have to figure out the right way to phrase this one. Okay, yeah. So I need to go check with some of the more salesy folks over at Buoyant to talk about what we've seen from customers. But the customer conversations that with other customers, the customer conversations that I've been part of have tended more towards treating clusters as units of isolation rather than anything else. So
Yeah, that's
if
certainly
you,
been the more modern approach. There was like
yeah,
a time
if you,
period where I remember people were
there was a
still
time when
reluctant to do
clusters were
multiple
expensive,
clusters.
yeah.
Yeah.
But even there, Linkerd is a security component, right? And so people tend to believe that Linkerd can do a good job of isolating chunks of your cluster without kind of going, oh my God, we have to isolate the different Linkerds. Has been my experience anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, console would have been the same way. So after the introduction of like cluster peering, it enabled a pattern of having different versions in different clusters.
Right.
But I don't see any use case for trying to actively run multiple versions in a single cluster. I don't think that would make sense. The upgrade case, though, I think is relevant. Just not for like long-term, like just basically some of the nuances of how would multiple controllers potentially interact with one or multiple mesh resources just for that upgrade case, because upgrading console control plane was scary.
Well, you just need to make it
the
less
thing-
scary is all.
Yeah, like it was the kind of thing that like there was definitely a lot of hesitation on the part of large users due to the risk of like upgrading a major infrastructure component. And I would like reach out to some of the folks that are still in the console team to ask about like if there is any consideration for upgrade strategies. Because I think like we had looked at some of like what Istio was doing with like the multiple version simultaneous upgrades as a thing of like, oh, should we maybe try that?
Sounds interesting.
Kind of related to my flip comment about making the upgrade case less scary. And yeah, it'd be very interesting to hear John's commentary on this, of course, but a lot of that stuff, it tended to feel to me when we ran across customers who were or users of, say, Emissary who were interacting with Istio as well. A lot of that upgrade stuff they would describe as being really a lot of added complexity instead of, like they tended to describe it as a necessary evil to mitigate the scariness of upgrading rather than really a feature. But like I said, I'm really curious to see, like John and Rob and people, what do you hear from people who are using Istio as their primary thing as opposed to people using another product who also happen to be using Istio?
I would say it's definitely in the necessary evil category.
Okay.
I mean, just YOLO upgrade is obviously always easier if it works.
That if is doing a lot of work there.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I like it. I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it's a very important idea, but it's certainly not a one optimized for easiest operations.
Yeah, we have seen people who just, will YOLO Linkerd in production, and we don't necessarily understand them. We try to make it work, but we do not necessarily understand those people. We think that's a very bad idea. Let's be clear about that. Try it someplace else first, please.
The issues we saw were like production environments just tended to be an order of magnitude larger than station environments. So like even if it went okay, like just the churn could cause like loss of leader election and all sorts of other issues that scared people.
Huh, interesting. I'm actually
So
gonna
what
have
I'm-
to take, I'm actually gonna have
Okay.
to take off in like 8 minutes. So let me throw in that I am worried a little bit about the slippery slope aspect of adding a mesh resource, but I'm not worried enough to think that this is a bad idea. I think that it's a good idea to have a resource someplace that we can put status on, and I definitely think having a place we can put status is a really good idea. So, so overall, I think that this is probably a good idea.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't hear any objections to the original use case, which is pretty
Yeah.
good sign, I think. And I think what we probably do is we move forward with that original use case, and then just if somebody comes with an idea to expand that,
Mhm.
for full transparency, that might be me in a couple of weeks. We just hold that to high scrutiny, and really kind of interrogate the use cases and figure out as a spec how you want to proceed. Does that sound like a
Yeah.
good, that captures the consensus pretty well?
And for the record, Keith, the idea that you would attach policy to the mesh as a way of setting defaults also makes sense to me. I think it might be likely that I end up bringing something to this group about defaults versus overrides. But that's going to be a different discussion, and I don't think it impacts the validity of attaching defaults to a mesh resource.
Sounds good. Defaults versus overrides are always fun.
I should clarify that although I raised this, or Nick, whoever, one of us raised the issue, I don't think either of us are volunteering to actually, lead a gap for it. It's just something that I know I'd love to see. So if anyone feels like taking this on, it
What
is
are you,
looking
you
for an owner.
implying that you have work to do or something, dude?
No, never.
Flynn calls BS on us having work to do.
Well, I was just going to follow that up by saying there's no chance that I'm going to have time to lead a gap on this for the rest of September. There's a small chance I could get to it in October if nobody beats me to it. But
I might, yeah, I was gonna say, I personally don't think I have enough of a dog in the hunt. Because I satellite a mesh team, but I don't work directly. But I might be able to, I'll ask Beaumont and see if he's interested. Not to
Cool.
sign him up for it or anything, but I think he might be interested. So, but I'm sure that will be a post KubeCon kind of thing. Sure of
Yeah.
it.
I think we should just assign it to Bruce Wayne, and then we
Do
can
it.
find out. Yeah, that we can make that slacker actually do something.
I'm suspicious of some of his ulterior motives.
Well, I mean, always a possibility. Yeah.
You either die a namespace scope resource or become the cluster scope resource that you didn't want to be. Something to that effect.
I would also say, is Arya new to everybody or just me? But in either case, welcome. Hi.
Yeah, welcome, Arya.
Yeah, I'm new to this meeting, to the API gateway.
Cool.
Hey, welcome.
Always nice to see new faces,
Yes.
or at least new names.
Yeah.
Keith, is there a 30-second summary of workload targeted policy, or is that just opening a can of worms and it would be better for me to jump off now rather than face all the worms?
I can try to summarize in 30 seconds. So what I've been working on the Istio side is, bringing some other resources to use Target Ref aligned with Gateway, the API policy attachment part of the spec. And a thought that occurred to me, I think John brought this up at some point in the past, but there's currently no way in the Gamma spec to target a set of workloads. Everything's kind of service-based, gateway-based, kind of at the policy targets proxies. But at the moment, there's no way for a policy that targets a set of workloads. Obviously in this, you've got a pattern. Every mesh pretty much has a pattern. How do we feel? And I'm curious to get like Shane and Rob's thoughts on this. How do we feel about? Well, I guess before we get to part about how we feel, do we feel like there is is there a compelling use case on the Ingress side for workload targeted policy? I think that if this is mesh only, that we can have that conversation. But I'm curious just to see if there's a value use case on the Ingress side for workload targeted policy. Obviously, might be Mike brought up might be a good one if we want to do like obviously for on the gateway side.
My experience with the Ingress side of the world really quickly has been that the Ingress side of the world does not make the kind of strong distinction that the mesh does between the service and the workload.
Yeah.
And so
I haven't
in
thought of this
Emissary,
before.
so in Emissary, for example, if you're talking about requiring authentication, then you are implicitly requiring authentication of a workload, not of a service, if that makes any sense. And it's a little weird because the thing that Emissary is going to consider an upstream and Emissary speak might be canarying between multiple services and things like that, but there is always this implicit belief, assumption that if you are doing that, then the workloads behind it must necessarily be considered equivalent. So yeah, the distinction between the service and the workload just is not nearly as much of a thing in Ingress land.
That kind of makes sense to me because you're applying policy at the gateway through which traffic is being funneled.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was actually a thing that was very strange for me coming over to the mesh side of the world and starting to understand that, oh no, wait, we actually have to care a lot about the distinction between the service and the workload and stuff like that. So Linkerd has a resource called Server that is there to be able to talk about the workload different from the service. John is raising his hand, perhaps to go and mock me for saying what I just said.
No, I actually completely agree. And to take it even more complicated, like in Istio ambient mesh, we have this waypoint thing, which is, it's both like an ingress and like a mesh at the same time. And this is one of the exact problems that we dealt with a lot. In the beginning,
a dessert topping and a floor wax.
It's all the worst of both. So like at first we were like, oh, we have a policy that attaches to workloads. We better implement that in the waypoint proxy. And so it's like, well, now I may have like 100 different workloads. So now I need like 100 different copies of all the policies. And we're like, this is not going to work out. And besides, like no proxy other than Envoy can actually do this. Like you don't apply policy after you load balance. It's usually one of the last steps.
Linkerd can actually do that.
Yeah, it's a normal proxy.
It's a little bit. It's a little bit of an artifact. Oh crap! I do have to run. It's a little bit of an artifact of the implementation, but Linkerd, the traffic will leave the origination proxy where load balancing happens, and then enter a destination proxy, which can itself go and implement policy at that point as well. So, so Linkerd has that interesting capability, which again could be a bug or could be a feature. We think it's a feature. Anyway,
yeah. And Envoy, we send it back to itself, and then it goes through another layer. So it's pretty, pretty terrible.
Yeah. All
Um,
right. I do have to run. I'm definitely interested in this, and I apologize for needing to take off. So I'll catch y'all in a bit.
yeah. Anyhow, one other thing we've been considering in the waypoint case. Well, first we changed so that you just apply policies to the waypoint, which is basically like how Ingress works, more or less, instead of to workloads. But one thing that I've been also looking into, which is only my opinion at this point, not the project's opinion, but is that maybe we should just apply them to service. And even though applying authorization policy to service, like what if they just don't go through the service? Yeah, it's super scary. Like we could just have another rule that says, no, you must go through the service. So it kind of has the ability to close that hole. Not sure that's a good idea. Just saying that there's a lot of options on where policies attach and how.
So I have thoughts on this, having worked on a mesh/spec that did apply policy to the service, or rather to an abstraction around the service. SMI, you applied policy to a route which ended up somewhat selecting a service. This got weird. It got very weird because of the fact that multiple workloads can belong to multiple services. And in fact, that is a pretty common use case outside of Nest. You're doing like a V1, V2 canarying, that sort of thing. You have the same set of workloads with labels, but one's V1 and one is V2. And so you've got one that's, and you want to be able to bounce between the two. You have like one service that has both V1 and V2, one for V1, one for V2. And so that was a bit complex, and also it's kind of difficult to turn into John's, the point John made. Oh, you came through the V1 service and you are, but the policy is on the V2 service, and so the policy no longer applies because you came through a different cluster domain. Like typically when it comes to, at least from what I've seen with customers, when customers are writing policy against their workload, it's because there's some sensitive information on the workload. The workload can handle certain paths, like the policy is meant to protect the workload itself. And so, we found limitations on that with OSM. And like in the current Istio sidecar-based architecture, you just apply policy to a set of label selectors. And typically, John probably has more horror stories, but I've typically only seen folks like apply a policy to a set of labels that tends to match with one workload, like with the app type label. It's logically typically the same container that's running. But yeah, just figure out that context from the OSM SMI side, but there's some hidden surprises when you start finding policy to service. That was not
Yeah,
super
I would
great.
say it's usually to like an app thing. The only other use case I've seen is something like a label that's like require strict MTLS, and then there's a policy that matches that label. I don't like it very much, but I have seen it before. But the label selection stuff is, I'm also not a huge fan. Like once you end up with a lot of different objects, you have like service matching pods, and then like gateway matching pods, and then authorization policy matching pods, and then HPA matching whatever it matches, or I don't know, all these things. It's like, if they're all matching the same label, fine, like it's kind of makes sense. But then once they're all like slightly different labels, and you have like this like N to M to X to Y to Z to Q to W, you run out of alphabet letters at some point, and you have no idea what's going on. It's like this absurd Venn diagram. So the target ref stuff is quite nice for that. And now for patching a workload, so it's very hard. So I don't know a solution there.
One thing that I looked into when I was looking into, trying to start again authorization policy for Gateway, was the Linkerd server resource. It was, I can't decide how I feel, and I hate that one had to go, but I can't decide how I feel about that resource because on the one hand, it describes, from what I understand, it's basically a resource to describe the network properties of a workload. So what port it listens on, That's the main one, as well as some other information. And if you apply a policy to that, then that's a good enough representation of a workload that you end up ditching some of the complexities of someone's doing way too many things. But it's a decent representation of like what it is you're wanting to buy into. Problem with that though is that now instead of just having their deployment and their service, etc., the user has to go and make a server resource or whatever we want to call it, like some sort of resource to kind of project their deployment or their stateful set or their daemon set or whatever it is, project that into the networking space of the cluster. And that can be, tedious, but there do seem to be kind of three options for workload policy for mesh. It feels like there's at least some consensus that at least on the mesh side, we kind of need a way to represent that. You either bind the policy to service, use labels, or you create some third thing that is a projection of the workload into the networking domain of your cluster, your mesh, whatever. It's kind of how I rationalize it, at least. So I'm taking that as silence. It sounds like nobody has strong opinions on, or rather, maybe folks have strong opinions, but just don't know how to phrase them.
I
on this.
have opinions, but no good ideas, so it's not very. I would love to solve this. I just, yeah, I don't know.
And so I may have missed this in the discussion, but it sounds like at least some meshes have an intermediate resource that describes a group of workloads that is not, say, a deployment or something. It's basically something that selects a group of pods. Is that a fair assessment, or is selecting a group of pods often just part of the policy attachment mechanism directly, like part of the policy?
I think different meshes do it differently. So Linkerd has a resource that selects a group of pods and says, hey, these pods have common network properties. They have these routes, they have these ports, etc. And then they attach policy to that. Then you've got the Istio case where the policy itself just selects the workload, or selects the group of pods rather. That's kind of the dichotomy that I've seen. And then OSM like Istio 1.0 applied the policy to the service. So we kind of, there are examples at least of all the different options.
Is there any, again, this is me not knowing the full use case here, but when I think of groups of pods, I mean, the most obvious one is service, which I know has its own connotations, but you could say that Kubernetes services already are a group of pods largely. But another thing you could say is that deployments or daemon sets or any of those are also groups of pods that are usually connected to each other, share a purpose, etc. Those are decidedly different than the label selection based world that I think meshes are coming from today. But it basically where I'm going with this is, do we need to create a new workload resource? I'm trying to avoid changing policy attachment to add yet another mechanism, like you can attach via object reference or by label selector. It just feels confusing to me. But I also hate the idea of you can attach via object reference to another thing that then attaches, like then is label selection, and like a new workload reason, like that I don't know. I mean, sure. So if there are any existing pieces we can use to get some part of the way there, I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't love the. I think it'd be generally better to move away from that, you know, n by x by y scenario that Don was describing. The if service was just a bag of endpoints, if we could just kind of tap in that back end rule of service, and I think the problem is pretty much solved. If service was just a pod grouping, then that's fine, and that's an appropriate to target to. But I don't know if that matches how customers use service, and so maybe what we're circling around is that we need to train users to use service differently, and to create, if you're going to do splitting, create a service that contains both two other services, and you make that a pattern, and then you attach policy to the grouping service. And yes, that's going to be an extra DNS name. It's going to have some other stuff that you might not want, or you might not want to use. You just want to use the grouping of pods that the service is selecting. Maybe that's the direction that we go. Because I'm not in love with the other alternatives either.
Just saying one thing that does exist, I'm not sure this is great, but it needs to have this idea of a canonical service, which I think is a bad name. It should probably be canonical workload or something, or application. But basically each pod has one workload name, and it's kind of a higher order name. It's derived from a variety of different labels with like some precedent logic, one being like the app label, which is kind of the most direct counterpart. In theory, you could attach to that. Yeah, just an idea. It's very opinionated, I would say. It's like instead of having a selector, you basically focus in on one single label and you match that more or less. So, there's probably been other, like, I haven't followed it along, but I know there's like the SIG application, or I don't know if there's SIG, whatever, that like whole application group. Like, I'm sure there's other things going on in Kubernetes land that are similar that I'm not familiar with, but you could assign basically a single identity to a pod. Kind of, we use it for telemetry today, so not it's super core.
Yeah, I can see the idea of that, but then of course, surely there are some pods that want to belong to multiple workload definition. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe workload is meant to be unique per pod.
Yeah, I think that's the idea.
In any case, service, you could get a little bit closer to removing some of that extra functionality if you used a headless service. That makes some changes, but it's still not great. DNS gets wonky then, which you just don't want DNS at that point. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is there. But I know that the long-term goal or whatever is that Gateway API becomes the front end and service becomes a collection of endpoints, with moving away from the front end concepts as much as we can. I mean, we're going to be stuck with them, but again, the idea is that there's a front end in front of service that is, and service is primarily just for collecting endpoints, which if you try and look into the future and believe we eventually achieve something like that, then service as a workload, a way to represent workloads, feels maybe not that far-fetched, but it requires some level of belief in future success. So you know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that because of the timeline. I don't know if we're at the stage to codify the pattern in the spec. I would like to, but there's so many different directions that Mesh is today. There's not a clear like tradition argument for doing one way versus the other. Because there's so many different options. And the future is so far into the future that I don't know that codifying it now is going to and making conformance tests against it, you know, like we want to do for something in the spec. I don't know if that's going to be putting strain on the ecosystem because the pieces aren't all the way there to make that reality work. I guess that's the underlying question is like how confident are we in that future so that service just becomes that cluster, that bag of influence.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I feel like there are not obvious solutions right now. I would love to see, again, I don't know who has the time for this, but I would love to see an attempt at a gap. I mean, you know, at the very least, we can, you know, even just agree with the problem, agree that these are the use cases we want to represent. It could get us part of the way to figuring out if the solutions we're thinking about even solve the use cases we're going for. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's maybe the best next step.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that I don't know which group specifically John was mentioning, but thinking about KubeCon, this would be a very interesting conversation to have. Like maybe it's tag app delivery, SIG. I will check all the different SIGs, but I feel like there's maybe somebody at KubeCon that like has opinions on this, on the abstraction that we're trying to make, which is essentially a group of. It almost feels like we're selecting for, hey, these containers share the same thing, and you want to be able to reference them and write policy based on the code that's running in the container. And maybe there's some SIG out there that has established patterns for that, or is working to establish patterns on that. So that might be a worthy KubeCon discussion if we can figure out and find the right people. Just a thought. Yeah, I've got to do some more thinking. I just want to bring it up though and see if, you know, see if anybody's smarter than me and came up with a perfect solution. So. So do we have anything else folks want to chat about in the last 9 minutes?
Nothing for me. This has been helpful though. I'll just say, I think many people on this call are planning on being at KubeCon. But if you haven't already communicated your plans to Shane or Nick or myself, that'd be helpful. We're trying to organize one or two things. Just who knows what'll actually work out, but it would be great to see people if you're there in person. Yeah, so just let us know if you're planning on being around.
I know I'll be there. So excited to see folks in person again and chat.
I don't think that I'll be able to make it this year.
Unfortunate. Hopefully we'll catch up with you whenever the next one is. And yeah.
Hope so, yeah.
Don't worry, it's the proposals for Paris are open.
Oh
So
man. Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's what I need to do.
That's crazy. KubeCon US hasn't even happened yet, and the CFP for ER.
Yeah, it's almost always, you know, the CFPs are closing a week after your flight, you know, back from KubeCon. You're just done with KubeCon and you've got like a week or less to finish up your proposal for the next one. And yeah, anyway. And this year there's a KubeCon India too, which I am really interested in. But 3 KubeCons a year is a lot. So
That's so much.
yeah.
Indeed. All right. There's something else. I'll give everybody 7 minutes back. It was great to chat with you all, and we'll talk again in 2 weeks. See y'all.
Yeah.
Yeah.